Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been going on for nearly 3 weeks. So I think we can try and do some preliminary assessments, some preliminary conclusions. Over the span of about 3 weeks, the Ukrainian forces have occupied 8 villages that no one has ever heard of, and in the process lost about 246 tanks, 595 armored vehicles, 279 artillery pieces, and about 13,000 troops. Scott, what conclusions can we draw about the Ukrainian counteroffensive so far?
Well, the key conclusion is that it never had a chance to succeed. But of course, that was a conclusion that could have and should have been reached by those who planned this operation even prior to its starting. And so if that's the case, you have to ask yourself, why did this go forward? And I think it's clear that this counteroffensive never had a legitimate military purpose. It was always done for political reasons. And then you have to ask who benefits from this political reasoning. The answer is NATO. NATO has, of course, poured tens of billions of dollars into building this Ukrainian capability. But the purpose of it is not to help Ukraine, but to hurt Russia. The goal here is to inflict pain on Russia, not necessarily to defeat Russia, which means that these casualties that you've outlined, they were predictable. It was known that they were going to occur, which means that NATO never cared about the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian soldiers, that NATO was always willing to sacrifice Ukrainian manpower to achieve a political objective, which means to shape the perception about the viability of continued assistance that will, of course, be discussed by NATO when they convene their summit in Vilnius on July 11th. And that's the harsh fact. This counteroffensive never had a chance to succeed. NATO knew this, but they let it go forward, which means they don't care about those 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers that have sacrificed everything for such a futile cause.
And you said that NATO benefits politically. Could you elaborate a little bit further on that? Because it seems that sending tens of thousands of troops to the grave and getting hundreds of tanks and other heavy armored vehicles destroyed, it doesn't seem like this delivers much tangible political benefit. What is the political goal here then?
Well, one has to keep in mind, that just what has happened in recent history. In August of 2021, NATO and the United States suffered one of their greatest defeats up until that time. Their greatest defeat, and that, of course, is the debacle of Afghanistan, and the precipitous retreat from Afghanistan by both the United States and NATO caused a lot of people in Europe to start to consider, what is the purpose of NATO? Why does NATO exist? If one of the goals of NATO is to create this unbreakable bond between the United States and its European partners, Afghanistan showed that that bond is easily broken, that the United States is fully capable of walking away from a commitment that NATO has made, in this case, to nation building in Afghanistan, that the United States didn't care about what its withdrawal from Afghanistan did to NATO. And so there were many in NATO beginning to question why NATO exists. And this, of course, for the political elites who depend upon structures such as NATO, the G7, the European Union to sustain their continued hold on power, this was the wrong direction. So NATO needed to redirect, events that allowed not the trend towards the disintegration of NATO to continue, but rather to create the conditions where NATO would not only unify, but expand. And Ukraine became that issue. This was a deliberate provocation on the part of NATO to provoke Russia to create the sense of crisis that would give relevance, renewed relevance to NATO. So when people say, what is the purpose to be achieved by throwing tens of thousands of Ukrainians into an early grave to sacrifice billions of dollars worth of military equipment much of it Western provided. What is gained from this? What is gained is NATO able to continue to cast Russia as a threat worthy of a revived NATO, to justify the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military rearmament that would be necessary to transform NATO from the broken down military alliance that existed prior to the initiation of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine to this vision that people like Jens Stoltenberg and others have articulated of a renewed, revitalized, expanded, powerful NATO. They need this war. They need, in many ways, a Ukrainian defeat, because a Ukrainian defeat allows them to say that the Russian military that's capable of defeating this Ukrainian force is a Russian military that can only be confronted by an emboldened, empowered, united NATO.
I want to return to the question of the viability of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because in the lead up to the offensive, there was a lot of hype among pro-Ukrainian military analysts, media outlets in the West, and there were basically two major arguments that they brought up. First of all, they said that Russian troops are spread thin over a front line that is 1,000 kilometers long. There's no way Russian troops would be able to defend such a long front line with their current resources. And the second argument they brought up is they said that Russian troops simply aren't that good, that they're not as well trained as Ukrainian troops, that their morale is lower. And now that Ukrainian troops will get more NATO quality weaponry, more NATO training, that this will just shift the balance decisively in favor of Ukraine, and they will be with relatively ease able to break the land corridor to Crimea. How have these assumptions stood up so far during the 3 weeks of the Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Well, I think the events on the ground have shown that these assumptions are fundamentally flawed, fatally flawed. But these are the only assumptions that these pro-NATO people could come up with, and let me explain why. What the Ukrainian military has been tasked with doing from a military perspective in this counteroffensive is the most complicated, difficult military mission imaginable, and that is an assault against a fortified position. This means that you're doing the breaching of a fortified position, and this isn't just any fortified position. It's called the Surovikin line, but in actuality, it's reflective of a current Russian defensive doctrine that has been prepared by Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk, a man who was the former deputy commander, I believe, of the 58th Army, involved in the Southern Military District in the early phases of the special military operation, a man who is cognizant of the realities of the conflict with a NATO-backed Ukraine. He was sent to the Combined Arms Academy in Moscow, where he perfected this new Russian doctrine, this new Russian defensive concepts. These were used to shape the Russian defenses, and then he was pulled out of the Combined Arms Academy and given command of the critical front, the Zaporizhia front, where he is coordinating the Russian defensive position. So we know that the Russian defenses are fully manned, and they are operating per doctrines. Now the Ukrainians have to attack this, have to assault it. And for a breaching assault to be considered a military success, it can't just dent the front line, penetrate the first line of defense, reach the second line of defense. It must go through all three layers and clear the Russian defenders from the far side of the final defense barrier. That's how you breach a defensive barrier. This was a mission impossible from the very start. Why? Because in NATO doctrine, to carry out this kind of breaching assault, the very first thing that has to occur is what they call suppression. You have to suppress Russia's ability to interdict, disrupt, or otherwise bring harm to your assaulting force. So as the Ukrainian forces close with the initial obstacle barriers, with the initial screening forces, the Ukrainian military must be able to prevent Russian air power from intervening, Russian helicopters from intervening, Russian artillery from intervening, Russian electronic warfare from intervening, and suppress Russian screening forces from being able to defend effectively. This requires Ukraine to have certain military capabilities that do not exist. There is no Ukrainian Air Force capable of clearing the skies. The Russians have ensured in the lead up to this counteroffensive that they have suppressed Ukraine's air defense system to a degree which the Ukrainians cannot use air defense to defend the area of interest, to prevent Russian aircraft from imposing their will. The Ukrainians have insufficient artillery to suppress Russian artillery, and the Ukrainians don't have adequate electronic warfare capability to jam Russian communications. So all of the things that would have to occur for any assault force to have a chance don't exist, and NATO knew this. NATO understood that the suppression aspects, the most important aspects of an assault breach, don't occur. So now, if you know this, how do you convince the Ukrainians to proceed with what is, in every sense of the word, a suicide mission? You have to create the conditions where the Ukrainians believe that even though they can't suppress the Russians, it doesn't matter because Russian troops will break under pressure. The Ukrainians were told that as soon as they apply any pressure, as soon as they threaten the Russian forces, these are poorly trained troops, these are recently mobilized troops, their morale is low, they will drop their guns and they will flee. They've also been told that Russian command and control is not effective, that the Russian generals are very lethargic, very slow to respond, are probably drinking, and as a result, aren't able to respond to a decisive thrust by the Ukrainians. They were told that it doesn't matter about Russian artillery supremacy. They will be able to jam Russian communications so that the Russians can't coordinate, and that it doesn't matter about the Russian Air Force because the Russians had an Air Force back in September and October, but the rapid pace of the Ukrainian advance negated that. This is what the Ukrainians were told, and it was all a lie. This was a suicide mission from the start. NATO knew this from the start, and that's the saddest reflection of this all, that NATO has deliberately misled their erstwhile Ukrainian friends to carry out an attack which was as suicidal as the charge of the Light Brigade, back in the Crimean War.
You know, in the 8 months preceding the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russian and Ukrainian troops were involved in a very difficult and bloody battle for the city of Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. And there was a lot of debate, during the course of the battle. To what extent did it make sense for the Ukrainians to pour in so many troops and resources into defending that city? Given that the counteroffensive has started and we have some time, some time has gone by, we can draw some conclusions. Was that a sound decision on the part of Zelensky and Ukraine's military leadership to hold on so, committedly to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk?
Well, let's put it in perspective. NATO has trained approximately 60,000 Ukrainian forces to be involved in this counteroffensive. The 9 to 12 brigades that NATO has been involved in equipping and training constitute around 60,000 men. Now, that is, of course, not the totality of the Ukrainian armed forces. There's many tens of thousands more troops out there, but these are the forces that have been allocated for this counteroffensive task. The battle for Bakhmut Artyomovsk is, based upon some calculations, has cost the Ukrainians between 50 and 75,000 dead. That is a number that exceeds or approximates the number of forces available for this counteroffensive. Imagine and we know this counteroffensive doesn't just involve the 60,000. The 60,000 are troops specifically trained for this assault operations, but many of the casualties of the Ukrainian units currently engaged in support of this counteroffensive come from territorial defense brigades and other Ukrainian forces that did not benefit, and I say that in the most
Delicate.
Yeah, I don't mean benefit. I don't think this NATO assistance benefited these forces at all. It actually made them weaker in many ways. But these supporting forces are engaged. They're suffering casualties. Imagine a situation where instead of suffering 50 to 75,000 dead in the battle for Bakhmut, Artemyevsk, the Ukrainians had withdrawn and carried out a more sensible, flexible defense, where they lost, say, 10,000 soldiers. You would now have 40 to 65,000 additional Ukrainian forces available to Ukraine, which provides a tremendous amount of operational and strategic flexibility. Those forces are gone. This was a disastrous decision by Zelensky. It was done for political reasons. He didn't want to look weak, in the face of Russia at a time when NATO was building up this counterattack force. He needed to continue to put pressure on NATO to provide more tanks, more armored fighting vehicles, more artillery, more ammunition, F-16 aircraft, long-range strike weapons. And you can't articulate that need when your troops are being seen as withdrawing from the battle. But this is where military experts needed to step in and say, no, we're not going to put our bayonet in the ground in Bakhmut and fight to the death, that we're going to actually withdraw, buy time until we build up a force adequate to the challenge that we've set upon ourselves to push the Russians back. Politics trumped military, and the end result is tens of thousands of dead Ukrainians, and putting Ukraine in an even worse position from an operational and strategic perspective vis-a-vis Russia.
Scott, I want to play devil's advocate for fairness' sake, because U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said last week, Ukraine's fight is a marathon, not a sprint. And when you look at Russia, what Russian President Vladimir Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu are saying as well, they're saying that Ukraine still has significant strategic reserves at their disposal, both in terms of manpower, equipment. Is there some chance that the Ukrainians could still turn this thing around, that maybe things got off to a rough start, but the Ukrainians can regroup and turn this counteroffensive into a success?
Well, I mean, you would need something, one of two things would have to occur. There would have to be a qualitative improvement in the overall capability of the Ukrainian military, meaning that something would have to occur to offset the advantage Russia enjoys in terms of air power, artillery, and things of that nature. This has become a war of firepower, and right now Russia enjoys unmatched capabilities. There's no Ukrainian solution to the planed bombs that Russia's dropping, the guided Fab 500s that are devastating the Ukrainian forces as they seek to assemble. There's no answer to Russian artillery. Russian artillery continues to enjoy, superiority both in terms of volumes of fire and in quality of fires over their Ukrainian counterparts. Russian helicopters right now are basically dictating the terms of the battlefield. Also, Russian tactics. These aren't poorly trained troops. We're taking a look at these Russian forces, and they're performing very well under fire. So something would have to happen to change that, which means that Ukraine would suddenly have to be empowered with a viable air force. People say that the provision of F-16s would do this, but that's unlikely, A, that they would get them in time, and B, that the F-16s would actually have that kind of impact on the battlefield. The Ukrainian air defense would have to become vibrant, but Russia has shown that the best systems that the West provides become victims to the Russian suppression of enemy air defense campaign. That the Ukrainians would suddenly have to become tactically proficient in the equipment they've been provided. You can't train a Ukrainian crew to be lethal in the use of the Leopard tank in weeks. You need months of training followed by years of hands-on experience to actually be able to employ these weapons in a tactically proficient manner. That's not happening. The same with the Bradley, the same with any equipment that's provided. So I don't see how this can happen, especially given the current situation where Russia continues to put pressure on all fronts. The other issue is, in order to do all that, you need troops that have, a high quality of training and motivation. Ukraine once had a very well-trained, motivated military, 260,000 strong in the lead up to this conflict. Those officers and non-commissioned officers are dead, wounded, prisoners, or just gone. The troops that are in place today lack this experience, lack this, um, the training to be effective. So even if Ukraine has provided certain weapons systems, the quality of the troops, the quality of the leadership just isn't there. You can't, during wartime, replace the kind of veteran experience that had existed. So you're looking for a miracle to happen. Um, is it possible? I mean, history shows. One only has to refer to the Soviet-Polish War of 1921, the miracle of the Vistula, where Budini's cavalry army was suddenly swept away by a reinvigorated Polish force. But I think if you study that campaign, you realize that the Russians made a lot of operational and tactical mistakes, creating opportunities for the Polish forces to counterattack. Could the Russians make similar mistakes? It's possible. Nobody's perfect, but I think that the approach that Vladimir Putin and his military leadership, inclusive of Defense Minister Shoigu, have taken to this is a much more measured approach. It's not a risk-intensive approach. It's one designed to play to Russian strengths. So I think if you're waiting for Russia to make a strategic mistake, an operational error that can be exploited by Ukraine, you're waiting in vain. The bottom line is there's literally not much NATO can do to reverse the tide of this conflict. Ukraine is on its back feet, and so Vladimir Putin rightfully respects the continued strength. A wounded snake can still strike out and bite you, and that bite can kill. And so the Russians have to be vigilant, have to respect the combat potential of the Ukrainians. These 13,000 casualties you speak of, remember, we're dealing with 60,000 troops that were trained by the West in the lead up to this offensive. So
Yeah.
there's still at least 47,000 of these troops left, and you have to respect that.
Yeah, of course. But I do think that you made an important point about how losses affect battle efficiency, because I was reading the New York Times earlier this week, and they were talking about how the graves in Western Ukraine, specifically Lvov, were becoming so crowded with the new casualties from Ukraine's counteroffensive that they were being forced to dig up veterans from World War I, World War II, and move them out of the graveyards to make way for the new dead. Now, obviously, this has a human component because there are people who lost their fathers, brothers. But let's talk about in terms of military effectiveness, because Ukraine has suffered relatively high casualties throughout the conflict. But we always ask the question, how sustainable is this? Can Ukraine continue to lose so many troops over such a sustained period of time and still retain its effectiveness on the battlefield?
Look, let's draw two imaginary timelines to answer this question. The first is the fact that a decision that NATO has made in the context of this conflict is to transition Ukraine from a Soviet-style military to a NATO-style military. And we've seen that with this counteroffensive. The troops were not only trained on NATO equipment, Leopard tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Strykers, Martyrs, others, but they were trained on the combined arms approach to conflict that NATO has embraced. It's a very complicated form of warfare that requires the ability to not only tactically maneuver, but to do so in coordination with supporting arms with other units, et cetera, this combined arms approach. It's very complicated. I used to do that as a Marine. But for the Marines to perfect this, let's just, again, talk about timelines. 13 weeks to train your basic Marine. Then the Marine has to go off for another 12 to 15 weeks, sometimes more, of advanced individual training to perfect the skill set of the military occupational specialty that he or she has been assigned. And then they're assigned to a unit where they're incorporated into a unit. It's not as though an infantry battalion suddenly receives 500 new Marines. The infantry battalion will receive 20 new Marines who are integrated into an existing unit that has Marines that have been there for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, Marines who have perfected the art of war, who know how to execute the close with and destroy the enemy through firepower and maneuver mission they've been given. And then even then, these Marines will go through a buildup period of at least 6 months, probably a year, where they are integrated into this unit and become a functioning part of this unit before the unit is given a military mission. Now, that is what is necessary to create a unit capable of successfully employing the combined arms approach to war that NATO is now imposing on the Ukrainian military. What do the Ukrainians have? That experienced military that they had that was built by NATO from 2015 to 2022 is gone. It no longer exists. It's replaced by troops who are brought in who aren't given the requisite level of training. They don't have 13 weeks to train a basic Ukrainian soldier. They're trained in a matter of weeks you can count on one hand. Then they don't have months to learn how to use this technologically advanced Western equipment. They're given weeks to do that. And then they're given a very shortened training curriculum to master combined arms warfare. You couldn't do that. Let me put it this way. If we tried to take Marines and train them the way that the Ukrainians are trained, the performance of the Marines on the battlefield would be similar to what the Ukrainians have, because you can't do this kind of complex warfare with troops that lack the training. And the longer this war goes on, the greater the demand will be for Ukraine to produce manpower, which means that the emphasis is on the numbers, not the quality, and therefore the training will continue to be reduced, compressed to the basic level of training necessary to do the most rudimentary operation on the battlefield. You can't have that level of training and expect them to perform as a NATO-style combined arms warfare capable unit. And this is the dichotomy that exists right now. The Ukrainians cannot do with that which they are being asked to do. They can't perform to the level required to successfully implement the operational objectives that they're being given by their NATO masters. Their battalion commanders are 25, 26, 27 years old. That is not a battalion commander. Their senior enlisted are guys that are in their 20s also that have 1, 2, 3 years experience. That is not a senior, that's not a non-commissioned officer. The Ukrainians simply don't have the junior leadership capable of taking these poorly trained Ukrainian soldiers and getting them to do these highly complicated military operations. And it's only going to get worse for Ukraine. The longer this war goes on, and I'm not talking about years, I'm talking about the coming weeks and months, more pressure is going to be put on Ukraine to generate new forces. You hear right now the need to do a mobilization to get 70,000 new troops up and running in as short a period as possible. Why? Because Ukrainians know that the 60,000 that were trained by NATO are going to be destroyed. Now, where are those 70,000 going to get their training? How good is this training going to be? What is the quality of the officer corps that's going to be commanding them, the non-commissioned officers? The answer is they're not going to have good training. Their officers are, while they might be motivated, are going to be poorly trained, incapable of doing complicated military tactics and operations. The same thing with their non-commissioned officers. You're going to have a unit of men that barely knows how to get up in the morning, get dressed, and stand in formation, and definitely doesn't know how to fall in on technologically advanced Western equipment and use it in the most sophisticated manner on the battlefield against an enemy who is everything the Ukrainians aren't. The Russians today are well trained, well equipped, well led, operating with sound doctrine that they're comfortable with and that they are implementing in a very sophisticated, efficient manner. There is no comparison between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces.
I want to remind our audience members that you are listening to the New Rules podcast on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest is Scott Ritter. Scott, in a few weeks' time, NATO leaders will be gathering in Vilnius, Lithuania. And we've talked about how the Ukrainian counteroffensive is sputtering, so that is going to be the background for this grand summit. What do you expect from the meeting, and what sort of new steps could they take in regards to the Ukrainian conflict?
If NATO was led by responsible actors, first of all, we wouldn't be in this situation because they would not have encouraged this conflict to occur in the first place. But, if there were responsible actors in NATO, they would have to reflect on the reality of the situation that exists. And that reality is that rather than Russia becoming weaker militarily, weaker economically, weaker politically, that this war has actually strengthened Russia on all fronts. Vladimir Putin is as firmly entrenched as the Russian leader, with massive support of the Russian population. The Russian economy, far from collapsing, has actually rebounded. If the statistics that came out of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum are accurate, and there's no reason to doubt them, we're actually looking at the strongest Russian economy in the history of the Russian Federation. Um, and then the Russian military, rather than being weakened, has expanded. It's become strengthened. It's backed by a Russian defense industry that's putting out high quality equipment in sufficient numbers to sustain the level of conflict. The performance of the Russian soldiers is admirable. The performance of the Russian leadership is exemplary. The Russians are stronger than they have ever been. That's the reality that NATO is facing. What does NATO have to go up against that? Um, yes, NATO has sought to expand. From a political perspective, it is imperative that NATO challenge Russia's ability to dictate NATO expansion by denying Ukraine membership opportunities. So NATO has sought to expand, and they have successfully brought in Finland. I think that strategically this will turn out to be an error for Finland and NATO, because it will only weaken NATO. It's created an extended additional border with Russia that now has to be defended. The Finns are going to be called upon to expand their military capabilities at a time when both Finland and NATO have budget problems. Economic realities in the post conflict world are such that um, it's almost impossible NATO to talk about expanding its military. Germany has talked about 100 billion euros to build up a new German army, but they've since said in order to do that, we're actually going to need something closer to 400, maybe 600 billion euros. But they don't have any money. The European Union's asking for more money to be made available to give to Ukraine, and the Germans have come out and said we don't have it. They can't afford this. NATO can't afford this. NATO is given away basically their strategic reserve in terms of equipment, ammunition. They've given it to Ukraine. It's been chewed up on the battlefield. NATO's now desperately looking for more to give. They have nothing left to give. The cupboards are bare, so to speak. They're seeking to create a new defense industry capacity to build the munitions and weapons necessary, but that's going to take years if it ever occurs, because they're not thinking strategically. Defense industry officials are saying, for us to do this, um, we need long-term contracting that makes it economically viable. We can't come in with short-term, limited duration contracts, which cause us to ramp up to produce a small amount of equipment. We can't afford to do that. You can't afford to pay for it. NATO is as weak as it's ever been. There is no unity. Turkey will not allow Sweden in. Hungary is threatening, is not, playing the game. And many other nations are also starting to question the viability of using NATO as a foil against not only Russia, but China. France has rejected the opening up of a NATO liaison office in Japan because they say that Japan is in the Pacific and NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they don't understand why a North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be involved in the Pacific. And there are many other NATO members starting to question what it is NATO is trying to accomplish. Even staunch supporters of NATO, like Great Britain, are starting to have NATO question what Britain's doing. The United States has come out and said, hey, you realize that if you continue to shrink your military, and let me remind the listeners that the British Army now is 72,000 strong. It's soon to be reduced to around 70,000, which means that you can put the totality of the British Army in any large soccer stadium in Europe and still have 30 to 40 unsold 30 to 40,000 unsold seats. That's how small the British are. They're becoming militarily irrelevant. Their military is so small, so inconsequential that they no longer factor into any responsible NATO military planning. And this is the reality of much of NATO. Even Germany doesn't have the military capacity that they should have. Their military is atrophied. They don't exercise the way they need to. They don't have equipment that is well maintained. Their Air Force, much of it is grounded. This is the reality of all of NATO. And so now NATO is going to gather, and they have to confront the fact that Russia is an expanding military power. They've gone from 900,000 to 1.5 million, probably going to be stronger because of temporary absorption of volunteers for the special military operation. Finland's going to have to deal with a new military district in Leningrad and increased forces on the Kola Peninsula that's going to require them to invest into their defense with what money, with what equipment, with what manpower. And this is the problem that's facing all of NATO as they roll into this Vilnius Summit. Now, that's if a realistic person is there. And a realistic person would look at it and say, we are headed down a path we can't sustain, and it would result in the ultimate collapse of NATO. So a responsible person would come in and say, how do we bring a halt to this trajectory? And that means that we have to bring an end to this conflict, which means that we have to fundamentally reevaluate our approach towards Ukraine and Russia. But you don't hear any of that rhetoric from the NATO leadership. So I think it's evident that NATO is going to come in and continue to play a bad hand, to double down on stupid, as I say, to further the existing failed policy, which unfortunately not only lead to more failure, but it will lead to the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, because I don't believe the Ukrainians can sustain this conflict. It's an unsustainable conflict. I believe their military is facing imminent collapse. And when the military collapses, there will be the political collapse of Ukraine. And that if the Russians are able to sustain their current level of commitment to the special military operation, that one could be looking at a strategic Russian military and political victory sometime in the next year.
And you bring up this really interesting dichotomy between NATO's political endgame and its material realities. I'm just taking a look at what NATO General Secretary John Stoltenberg said on June 19th. He said, and I quote, "Our weapons and ammunition stocks are depleted, not just in Germany, but in many countries across NATO." We saw something similar being said by EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell just one day later, when he said that the European Union is currently lacking critical material needed to produce ammunition. So you hear these statements, but at the same time, you hear people like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, many of his NATO counterparts, saying that we will continue to support Ukraine as long as necessary. How long can they keep this dichotomy up? How long can they keep up this sort of disconnect between their political goals and their material realities?
Rhetoric is nice when it's in isolation. So you can have these political officials get before a camera and they can speak words. And when you have a Western media that plays the role of stenographer as opposed to journalist, they don't ask questions, they simply record and regurgitate what these officials say. It's very easy to shape a perception amongst an audience that is physically separated from the realities of the battlefield, so that everything is good. But eventually, reality kicks in. You can use as an example the Iraqi information minister during the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, who's derisively nicknamed Baghdad Bob. He would get on TV every day and give these optimistic speeches about how the performance of the Iraqi army is good, how the Americans are being defeated, they're being pushed back. And his final broadcast in Baghdad, while he was making that statement across the river, M1 Abrams tanks were driving around. And it meant that the war was over. So at some point in time, rhetoric collides with reality, and reality will crush rhetoric every step of the way. So Lloyd Austin can say whatever he wants, but it's not going to change the outcome on the battlefield. NATO can get together and talk about how resolutely they're going to support the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians need massive quantities of ammunition, and NATO doesn't have it, and they can't produce it. So Ukraine's not going to get it. And so at some point in time, all the rhetoric gets flushed down the toilet of life, and reality hits hard. And the reality is that as things currently stand, Russia cannot be defeated in Ukraine by either Ukraine or the collective West. That Russia holds a winning hand, and if Russia plays this hand appropriately, Russia will prevail, and no amount of words coming out of a NATO summit in Vilnius can alter this outcome.
At the same time, I do suspect that the United States and NATO still have some cards up their sleeves. For example, we now know that NATO has begun training Ukrainian pilots how to fly F-16 fighter jets, and we see from different current and former policymakers in Western countries proposing to send long-range missiles to Ukraine, cluster munitions, A-10 attack aircraft. So there are some, more cards up NATO's sleeve. Do you think that if the West sends these new wonder weapons, so to speak, to Ukraine, that could somehow help shift the balance back in Ukraine's favor?
Well, the answer is no on no matter how you look at this. First of all, let's just be realistic here. The F-16 has been around since the 1970s, as has the A-10. Now, it's been modified, updated avionics, refurbished airframe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to call it a wonder weapon, for a wonder weapon to really exist, it means when it appears on the battlefield, nobody ever. I'll give you an example from history. There are clips of American B-17 bombers flying over Germany late in the Second World War, when suddenly this jet fighter appears, going right across. It was the Messerschmitt 262. Nobody had ever seen it before. It took everybody by surprise. They're like, what the heck is that? That was a wonder weapon. Had the Germans been able to produce the ME-262 in sufficient quantity and employ it earlier in the war, it could have changed the outcome of the strategic air campaign, because we were taken by surprise and we had no effective counter to it. So to call the F-16 a wonder weapon is ludicrous in the extreme. The Russians have known about the existence of the F-16 since it was produced. I imagine that Russian intelligence has a very solid understanding of the performance characteristics of the F-16, and that Russian Air Force pilots are trained in overcoming the F-16 in air-to-air combat. The Russian air defense has developed the appropriate technologies and radars, et cetera, to shoot down the F-16. This is not a wonder weapon. Moreover, for the F-16 to have maximum performance potential, it needs to be maintained and operated by a military that is intimately familiar with the airframe. Yes, there might be training some Ukrainian F-16 pilots as we speak. Maybe if they're smart, they're taking a handful of Ukrainian mechanics and teaching them the basics of F-16 maintenance. The F-16 is an old airframe. It requires an extensive amount of maintenance to make it operational. Turning F-16s over to the Ukrainians isn't doing them any favors. The Ukrainians would be better off receiving more MiG-29s or more Su-27s. These are Soviet-era airframes that they know how to operate. They're competent in the use of. You give them F-16s, all you're guaranteeing is that every single pilot that's inside that F-16 will die. That F-16 will have zero impact on the battlefield. Let's also look at the reality of these aren't going to be the newest model F-16s. In fact, it appears that the first F-16s that will be provided to Ukraine, if that decision is made, will be from the Netherlands. The Netherlands had said, well, we can't give you these F-16s until they've reached the end of their operational lifespan for the Netherlands. We bought these. They have a certain amount of time that they're designed to operate on. When they exceed that, meaning that we can no longer use them because their contract, basically they've exceeded their their certificate of operational. We're going to turn them over to Ukraine, which means Ukraine's getting old fighters that don't work. They're going to have to be constantly maintained. It's as if we want the Ukrainians to lose. I mean, look at the Italians. They provided the Ukrainians with a number of M109 artillery pieces, and I think everybody is familiar with the video of the trains full of these artillery pieces heading off, and everybody's going, more NATO equipment to Ukraine. Every single one of these M109s don't work. They were turned over to Ukraine in non-functioning status, and they aren't on the battlefield because they're in warehouses being maintained right now. That's the reality. You give the Ukrainians F-16s, that most of them won't get off the ground, and the ones that do get off the ground will be shot down. There are no such thing as a wonder weapon. The ATACMS is a system that has existed for many years. The Russians know everything about the ATACMS. Their air defense capability, their anti-missile capability will rapidly adapt to this. There is no wonder weapon. The A-10, it is a slow, low-flying aircraft that has zero survivability against an integrated air defense system. Just look at the performance of the A-10 during the Gulf War that I fought in 1991. When it got low enough and got locked into Iraqi air defenses, even in the final stages of the war, it was shot down, because that's what happens when aircraft like the A-10 get locked in by air defense systems. The Russians have an air defense system that the Ukrainians cannot suppress. So any aircraft that are provided will be shot down. But here's the most important aspect of it. None of this equipment will be provided in a timeline sufficient to have any impact on the battlefield. because right now the current trajectory of this conflict is that Ukraine will exhaust its military capacity to continue a sustainable, viable defense sometime by the end of summer, early fall.
Oh
And
boy.
none of this equipment that you're talking about is going to be available by that time.
I want to remind our audience members that you are listening to the New Rules podcast on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest today is Scott Ritter. Scott, I have no doubt that militaries around the world are closely analyzing the Ukrainian conflict, breaking down every single detail to try and find out what the future of war is going to look like. What lessons can militaries around the world draw from the Ukraine conflict? What technologies, what strategies are the ones that are most likely to be promising in future conflicts?
Well, I think two things have emerged that are new, the new face of war.
Don't do
And
that.
one is the extent to which drones have been integrated into
You're
every
leaving the
aspect
door open. All
of
the air
modern
conditioning is
conflict,
running like
from
crazy. Come on.
standard reconnaissance, target acquisition, target designation, electronic warfare, and loitering munitions, using the drone as a weapon. This is a new reality, and because of the impact of drones, both armies, Ukrainian and Russian, have had to develop counter drone capabilities. I, when I was in Moscow in May, in the lead up to the May 9th Victory Day parade, I attended the rehearsal, and all around me in Moscow were units walking around with these fantastic looking weapons, anti-drone guns, that electronic warfare designed to take control of the drone, to jam the signal of the drone, to otherwise neutralize the drone. And they were deployed all around Moscow, and I'm sure there were even more sophisticated versions layered out there. This is a new reality that if you don't have an anti-drone capability that is beyond simply what we would call anti-air defenses, beyond Stinger missiles, things of that nature, you need a whole new level of anti-drone capability to contend with the drone threat. And if you don't have that, you will be overwhelmed by drones. They will come in and take out your command and control. They will take out critical military infrastructure, et cetera. So drones is something that people are going to have to look at. And I know people are going to say, well, the United States have been doing drones for a while. No, we haven't, not on this level. Again, the scope and scale of the violence of this conflict is beyond the imagination of NATO. That's General Cavoli, the commander of the Supreme Allied Commander, saying this. That means that we're not prepared for any aspect of this. The other thing that I would point out is just the role played by old-fashioned artillery. Um, Again, to quote General Cavoli, the scope and scale of the violence, and much of the violence that's been brought to bear on this battlefield is brought in by artillery, and the Russian dominance of the artillery. The United States has, for some time now, and together with NATO, de-emphasized massed fires and instead focused on precision fires. And so we have shrunk our ability to deliver quantities of fire, and instead we've been focusing on the quality of the fire. The war in Ukraine is not about quality of fire, it's about massed fires with a quality result, meaning that you need a lot of artillery capable of precision strike. The Russians are the only military in Europe today that have artillery of sufficient quantity and quality to fight on a modern European battlefield. And this is a lesson that the West has to take. They have to completely revamp their approach to artillery, both in terms of the numbers of artillery systems and how they employ it. The Russians have perfected this and are in the process of perfecting it. The Ukrainians, with the tip of the hat, are doing a good job as well. Just ask any Russian soldier who's been on the receiving end of Ukrainian artillery fire. The Ukrainians are very good, very lethal. They just don't have enough of this. And the West isn't in a place to advise the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are actually having to adapt Russian artillery employment techniques and strategies. They can't rely on the lessons from NATO because NATO wasn't prepared for this fight. So those are two things. Electronic warfare is another very big one. The United States and NATO in the last 20 years have been developing something we call the full spectrum dominance. That is, when we go to war, we're going to dominate the enemy full spectrum wise. We're going to control, communicate. We're going to have perfect interoperability. We have everything computerized, digitized. We have satellites overhead. We have aircraft relaying signals so that there is perfect command and control. That a commander in the field has total situational awareness, and therefore we're able to adapt, overcome, and overwhelm the enemy with the totality of our military capacity. The problem is the Russians will just simply hit the off switch and none of this will work because we developed this in the context of the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, where the enemy didn't have any ability to interfere in a meaningful way with this total spectrum dominance approach that we've taken. The Russians have the most sophisticated electronic warfare capability in the world. And they just asked the Ukrainians how difficult. One of the reasons why this counteroffensive is stalling is that the Ukrainians were trained on this combined arms approach by NATO, which requires command and control connectivity throughout to coordinate movement and fires. And then the Russians hit the off switch and all that goes out. Nobody's talking to anybody. And this collapses in a heartbeat. And I think the West is looking at what the Russians are doing and realizing that if they tried to go to war against Russia today, it would be a disaster because Russia has perfected these new aspects of war. And then at the end of the day, it just comes down to the quality of the man on the ground. I mean, the foot filling the boot is connected to a body that needs to be physically fit. It needs to have a brain that is capable of doing tasks under stress. And I'm not going to say that the Russian soldier is the perfect soldier. He's not. But he is a sufficient soldier. He is an adequate soldier. He is a soldier that's capable of performing the deadly job of modern war on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis. He has a system that's capable of sustaining him logistically, of controlling him from a command and control perspective, and most important of all, the soldier is linked to a motivation of service to nation. And that's very important. The Russian soldier believes in what he is doing on the battlefield. And this is something that cannot be eliminated when we talk about electronic warfare, drone warfare, artillery, and the technology of war. At the end of the day, war is very much a human struggle, and you have to focus on the human factor. And if the West is looking at this, they need to understand that the human factor when it comes to the Russian fighting man is of extremely high quality. Again, look at the planning assumptions that were made by the West in regards to this Ukrainian offensive, that the Russian soldiers would run away. Russian command and control would not function. This has been proven to be false.
And my final question has to do with tanks. Because as I'm sure you know, the military analyst community loves debating the question, are tanks obsolete? And every chance they get, no matter what conflict it is, they bring up this question, are tanks the way of the past? What's your take, Scott? Do tanks have a place in the 21st century?
Well, the answer is yes, of course they do. Tanks have a very lethal role on the battlefield. It's just that modern militaries aren't designed to absorb the casualties that massed tank warfare generate. Um, you know, could the Russians line up 3,000 tanks and try and force the Ukrainian position with big aero offensive? Of course they did. They did that during World War II. But take a look at every big aero offensive that the Soviet army carried out against the Germans or the Germans carried out against the Soviets, and look at the casualties that were accrued by this, the number of tanks that were lost. That was supposed to be the heyday of armored warfare. But look at the number of tanks lost, for instance, the battle for Kursk. Look at the number of tanks lost in the drive towards Berlin, in the battle for Berlin. Look at the number of tanks lost in the drive to Prague. These are closing stages of the war, and when the Soviets had all the advantages, and yet they're losing tanks in large numbers because that's what happens in very intensive combat. And so people today are saying, well, the tank is outdated. It's not outdated. The tank is just a very good weapon system, but if it's employed in modern warfare against an enemy that has advanced tank killing capabilities, it just means that you're going to lose tanks. And nobody is conditioned to lose that number of manpower and systems today. You know, I think the other thing is that the West has developed a sort of a exaggerated sense of capability for its own weapon systems, in particular the M1 Abrams, and the Leopard the Challenger, the Leclerc. These Western weapon systems were designed to take on Soviet era tanks, um, and they really haven't advanced that much in terms of their capabilities. The Russian tanks, however, have gone through a radical evolution to adapt to this new Western technology. It's the same thing that when I talk about, the F-16 can't be a wonder weapon. Trust me, the M1 Abrams is not a wonder weapon. Russian tankers have been studying the Abrams forever, and Russian defense industry has been developing capabilities not only to defend Russian tanks against Western weapons, but to destroy Western weapons with Russian weapon systems. Um, and so, we can look right now. Take a look at, for instance, the Leopard as it advances on the battlefield. You don't see too many instances of the Leopard receiving multiple hits and continuing to move. The Leopard is struck, is disabled, is destroyed in short order. But there's been some pretty impressive videos coming out of the new T-90 Russian tank advancing on Ukrainian positions. One where I think it absorbed 19 hits of
Wow.
either mines or anti-tank weapons and continued to move forward. Um, I'm not saying it's invincible. I'm saying that one needs to respect Russian technology, Russian know-how, and the fact that the Russians have built a system designed for combat. But again, the Russians right now are not in the business of sacrificing manpower for short-term military gains. And so you're not going to see the tank used as a massive mailed fist to punch through defenses. Why? Because then Russian tanks would be burning just like the Leopard tank is burning. You will suffer casualties. What we're seeing is that the tank is now, instead of being used as the principal weapon, the tank is being used as one of many weapons that work together in harmony to achieve a desired outcome. That when the time comes for an armored pillbox to move forward and suppress the enemy, that's the role of the tank. But it will be supported by infantry fighting vehicles, dismounted infantry, artillery, helicopters, aircraft that suppress the enemy's ability to interdict the tank. So the tank becomes, one of many weapon systems. And I think that's the reality of the modern battlefield is that the tank is no longer the dominant weapon on the battlefield. It is one of many important weapons, which, if they work together in harmony, create a dominant military presence on the battlefield.